That's how you do the
I just made it all really loud. So we're going to get started. I put my watch on upside down, so that's my excuse for why we're starting at 3:07. My name is Andrea Douglas, and I'm the executive director here. We are very excited about this program this afternoon for a number of reasons. We've been very busy lately rethinking how we do our local history and what is the Isabella Gibbons Local History Center really going to be about. We have always done genealogy. We've always done education on how to do genealogy. We have, on occasion, done lectures. Angela did something for us last year as well. But now we are thinking that we're moving more into the digital humanities. We are creating and making access to data. And so making access to anything means you have to play with your brand new toys. So just to let you know, we are live streaming this afternoon's event, so that if you feel as if you've missed something in your note-taking, don't worry, it'll be put up on our channel within the week. So we are also thinking about how do we expand the kinds of conversations that we have, and how do we acknowledge the partnerships that we've created. We have been a partner with Berger Brown Step After Genealogy Group since we opened. We rely on them for quite a lot of the knowledge that we have and the expertise that we're able to provide. So we're very happy to be able to partner with them now. We, through Shelley Murphy, have gotten more closer to OBS and Maggie, thank you, to Maggie. So we're hoping to see a deeper, richer partnership that gives us the opportunity to do even more education here in the space. So it's this presentation also allows us to engage in subjects that we don't easily engage in. We are a 20th century institution. It's our main concern. Enslavement are things that we talk about and think about because of its impact in the 20th century. Larger histories are not things that we always talk about. So this presentation today gives us that opportunity to also engage in the conversation around 1619. So thank you all very much for coming. I greatly appreciate your support, your time, your interest, and your goodwill. And I will turn it over to our guest speaker, Angela Walton-Ross.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here to speak with you, to share with you actually a personal journey. It is a research journey of mine. And one of the things that we all have, we all come and carry with us our own narrative. We carry our own family's narrative. Sometimes we just keep it in our head, keep it in our memory, based on things that we've heard as we were children. Sometimes we share it with others. And when I first moved to the Mid-Atlantic area in 1990, which was a few years ago, I was able to take advantage, finally, of living close enough to the National Archives, where I was able to engage in some research. That led to an interesting discovery, some of which I knew a little bit, most of which I knew nothing. And I was able to undertake the research journey on my family. My family, of course, the title of my book, which you can see, is Freedmen of the Frontier. Well, what frontier are we talking about? At the time, in the 1800s, in the mid-1800s, it was definitely the frontiers. My childhood was spent living in a frontier town. Some of you may have heard of my hometown, in a little foreign country called Arkansas. And you may have heard of that neighboring country to the west, Oklahoma. And my family's history began right there on the border. And for me, in terms of started that research process in 1991. I was prepared for some of what I was going to find, but a majority of what I found was truly remarkable and was unknown to almost everyone in my family history. So I'm going to share with you some. She was my babysitter until I went to kindergarten. Every day, as opposed to going to preschool, I went to Nana's house. And until kindergarten was over, then of course until the afternoon, I was taken back to Nana's house after kindergarten and spent the rest of the day until my parents would pick me up and take me home. She was my heart. We all knew her, and she was the matriarch of the family. A little bit about her history was that all we knew is that Sally, well, you know, she's part Choctaw and she's from the Choctaw Nation. And in a city like Fort Smith, Arkansas, which is on the border of what was at one point the Choctaw Nation and became the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. Well, everybody in a city like Fort Smith, and you may have heard of our most famous citizen, Judge Parker, the famous hanging judge. He's our most famous citizen. But he oversaw through his court affairs and events that took place in Indian Territory, where Sally was born. And all we knew is that she was there and at one time had lived a good portion of her life in the Choctaw Nation. I knew she had a half-brother. Once, I think, when I was a small child, her brother came to visit her. He was an old man, but she always had this picture of him as a young man on the wall. That's Uncle Joe. Now, by the time he was an old man, he was a white-haired gentleman with little whiskers. But Uncle Joe, as far as I knew, Uncle Joe was a white man. He just white as any white person I met. But he was her half-brother. And what amazed many of us when he would come to visit her, they would sit out on the porch, both of them smoking pipes, by the way, and they would have a conversation in Choctaw. And it was always, what are they doing? What are they saying to each other? But that was Uncle Joe coming to visit his sister, Sally. Sally died in 1961. I was a young girl. I was still in grade school. And she passed away in 1961 in Fort Smith, where she was buried. And after her death, an old family Bible was given to my mother. And this was her Bible. And it was a Bible which, as many old Bibles contain, there were a few pages that reflected the family history. One or two names I recognized, and the rest of the names were totally foreign. And some of the details from the old Bible, occasionally I would see some reference. If you look on the right, you see someone, looks like Anthea, but she was actually called Manda or Amanda Hunt, died in 1898, had no idea who Amanda was. And underneath you see something scribbled, I.T. Still had no idea what that meant. And there were other names in that Bible as well. On the left you see someone called Houston. He was born in 1886. But again, whoever he was, it was not certain. And someone called Ethel, who died in 1903. And again, that IT appears in the bottom of that page. And it was not clear until much later, it was nothing but a postal abbreviation. That meant Indian Territory. Indian Territory eventually became what we all know as the state of Oklahoma. Oklahoma did not join the Union until 1907. And again, other details at the bottom. Houston, whose name appeared on the previous page, on another page, we see that he passed away in 1904, and of course you see the designation IT. There was another document that was folded up inside the Bible, and it was a plat map, a small plat map, at the bottom of which you can see Sally's name. And I used to pull out this Bible from time to time and just stare at it. And at the very top, you can't see it very clearly, but it says township number and range number, and up above the line, but very faintly, the stamp appears, Choctaw Nation. And that was basically all we ever had, connecting Sally, whom we knew and loved until she passed away, to the Choctaw Nation. But it meant something, obviously, because she kept it folded. to 1991. This was in May of 1991. The previous week from that first trip to the National Archives, I had attended a conference. It was the annual conference of the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society, and their conference took place in Washington, D.C. And at that particular conference, there was a presentation on researching Native American ancestors. And the focus of the presenter, who was a gentleman from the Library of Congress at the time, he was focusing on tribes in South Carolina and spoke a lot about Catawba Indians. And so I raised my hand and asked, well, what about the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma? And he said, oh, Choctaws, oh yeah, they're part of 5 civilized tribes. That's record group 75. That's where you'd find information on them. And that's all he had to say. But I wrote that down, and the following week I took a day off and made a trip to the National Archives. And that was May 1991, and I can assure you that my life was changed forever after that trip to the National Archives, because I found them. Now, a little bit about my family. I have one brother, no sisters. My brother's name is Samuel Walton. My father's name is Samuel Walton. My grandfather's name, my dad's father, was Samuel Walton. And his father's name was Samuel Walton. Yes, there are 4. And yes, the first of the 4 Sams in the family, he was born in Arkansas, across the border, born in the U.S., born in Arkansas, Northwest Arkansas to be exact. Northwest Arkansas today is famous, well, for 2 things: the Razorbacks, if you know college football, and the birthplace of Walmart, founded by a man called Samuel Walton. I've yet to find a relationship, although I am not a greedy person, and I will only ask for 1%, and they will never hear from me ever again if I ever find that connection. However, so far, there's nothing connecting my Samuel with the Walmart Samuel Walton. However, what's interesting is that all I knew was Sally's husband was Samuel, as was my grandpa Sam. And of course, Sally was the wife, and I couldn't believe it when I started going through this reel of microfilm. And those of you who've been doing genealogy for some time, if you've been doing genealogy more than a dozen years, you know that there was no such entity in 1991 as Ancestry.com. There was no digitized genealogy world. That meant I had to crank reels of microfilm and do it the old-fashioned way, thread the machine. And when I had first pulled out a set of records at the archives, I was going through records of Choctaws, and I didn't even see towns or post offices that I knew. And I consider myself somewhat familiar with eastern Oklahoma, but I saw nothing until I pulled up a reel of microfilm called Freedmen. And so I looked, and I pulled up the records and started cranking that microfilm. And I'm not superstitious. I don't gamble or play the numbers, although I really should. I do admit to buying occasional records to get from time to time. But I must say, if you look in the upper right-hand corner, when card number 777 appeared, I hit the lottery, because as you can see, I found Samuel Walton, Sally Walton, their son Houston Walton, remember the name from the Bible, Sam Jr., that's Grandpa Sam, and someone else called Louisa. And when I was sharing this with cousins, they said, oh no, we don't call her Louisa, that's Louisa. That's Grandma Louisa. So I found Louisa in the household. And I studied the card. Here they are living in Scullyville, in Oak Lodge community. And I see Choctaw Nation stamped across the top, Freedmen Roll. And underneath Freedmen Roll, you see a column, and it says very clearly, slave of Jim Davis, Emily Perry. And if you go back to the left, look at Sam. Sam's name going across the right, he was a slave of someone called Jim Davis. Sally, whom I knew in my lifetime, who did not pass away until 1961. Sally was a slave of someone called Emmeline Perry. These names had never been a part of any name that had been uttered in my childhood, nor my father's childhood, and no one in the family ever heard of these individuals. So of course, I was curious as to who these other folks were. And of course, as you can see more closely, I've blown it up more clearly for you. You see the names of everyone. And sometimes if you hear people talking about Native Americans and oh, they have a roll number and a card, the roll numbers are right to the left of their names. And this was reflecting my family in the Choctaw Nation, but as freedmen. Freed as opposed to being enslaved. What exactly did that mean? And on the reverse side of the card, there was more information. If you look at the front, you see 5 people. You see Samuel, Sally, Houston, Sam Jr., and Louisa. And on the back, on the same 5 lines reflecting people whose names were on the front, you see the father of Samuel was someone called Pat Bernard. Oh my God, I'd never heard of that name. You also see some information of the tribal enrollment. Well, Pat was CIT means non-citizen. But following that line over to the right, the name of the mother, that's reflecting Samuel's mother, Lydia Bernard. Oh my God. And the name of the mother's slaveholder. Then Sally, again, the woman whom I had known. Her father's name was Eastman Williams. He lived in Scullyville, the same community, but he was not owned by anyone because he was clearly Choctaw, and it says he was Choctaw Indian. And then her mother, Manda Hunt. Remember the name from the family Bible. It was Miss Amanda, or it had been written as Andia, but it was Amanda Hunt. Of course that name would be in the Bible. It was the mother of one of the people who owned the Bible. And she was from Sugarloaf, and her slaveholder was someone called Emmeline Perry. So this was absolutely amazing. I only knew Sally as a child. I never knew Sam. Great-grandpa Sam died in 1912, and she outlived him 40-something years. She didn't pass away until 1961. So I knew I had to find out a lot more. And there was a finding aid. At that time, the finding aid published by the National Archives looked like this and has a different cover now. But that finding aid revealed that there were a lot more records pertaining to freedmen of other nations as well. And again, I had a really steep learning curve. I really had to find out what I was seeing. I found as a result, there were Cherokee freedmen. There were other Choctaw freedmen, of which Sally was a part. There were Chickasaw freedmen. There were Creek freedmen. And there were Seminole freedmen. So again, I realized my head was really spinning. I was really thinking, wow, wait a minute. Why don't I know that? I grew up in Fort Smith. We talked about Indian Territory history. Never did anything or any population referred to as freedmen ever come up, and never was anything about what they were freed from, clearly from enslavement. This was not anything that was widely known. So I had lots of questions. What in the world did that mean exactly? So, were they really enslaved as we know slavery in America? And what exactly was this? Was it widespread? How did this happen? And when did it happen? So I had an incredible history lesson that I had to really embark upon to learn a lot more. Who were the freedmen, and when did slavery begin among these Indian tribes? Now, one point, Cherokee Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminoles. They were among the 5 major tribes from the southeastern part of the United States that were moved westward, that were removed from their ancestral homelands to the west. We all hear of the Trail of Tears, but what we don't hear is that Africans were on that trail as well as people enslaved in those nations. I had to find out a little bit more about slavery and enslavement. Of course, my interest began with the Choctaw Nation because Sally was Choctaw, but what does this mean? The Rise and Fall of the Choctaw Nation by Angie DeVoe was at one time a professor at the University of Oklahoma. She mentioned frequently Negroes, slaves, freedmen. She would use those words. But I still wasn't getting a clear idea of who they were. I began to read more. Daniel F. Littlefield, who is now professor at the University of Arkansas, was a student of Angie DeVoe. And he would be in classes with her and wonder, who are these freedmen? That word is suggesting something else was going on in Indian Territory besides removing tribes. And he went into detail and wrote an incredible book called The Chickasaw Freedmen. He also wrote another book called The Cherokee Freedmen, From Emancipation to American Citizenship. And it was just as useful. And these 2 books in particular are the most revealing in terms of not only who the people were, but how they adapted to life once enslavement ended. And in those places in particular, and all of those 5 tribes, slavery was not abolished until 1866, when the tribes signed a treaty in Fort Smith to abolish slavery forever in those nations. But the fact that there were Africans on the Trail of Tears is probably one of the most undertold stories. Even though these freedmen, who numbered literally in the thousands, have never had their stories. When you hear slavery in the United States, we think of the image of plantation slavery, or, of course, many of us know slavery took place in cities, slavery took place in the north as well. But we rarely, if ever, hear of slavery taking place on the western frontier. And even less, those who were taken west on the forced migration of Native people to the western frontier. How far back did this history go? The earliest that I was able to find, because it is said that part of the story reflects the earliest documented case. Now, this does not mean it's going to include other cases of slavery that involve Native Americans when they were enslaved. This is a story that begins around the middle of the 1700s in an incident known as the Battle of Kaliwa. And in that particular story is the story of the most beloved woman, Nancy Ward, of the Cherokee people. That was a battle between Cherokees and Creeks at that particular time. And in that confrontation, there was a woman whose husband was killed. She was so horrified and outraged, she ran to her husband's side, as is depicted in the art, and she grabs his weapon. She takes his weapon, and she kills the man who killed her husband. People in her tribe and her circle were so amazed at her bravery. She was given a title of Most Beloved Woman, Gigao in the Cherokee language. Gigao meaning Most Beloved, and she was given a prize that day for her bravery. Her prize was a Negro slave. She became the first and earliest, at least to date, documented owner of slaves among Cherokee people. By the early 1800s, she was a regular purchaser of slaves. She also became a wealthy woman. Many of the leaders in the Cherokee Nation, as well as other tribes, many of them had been intermarrying with Europeans early on, as early as the 1600s, and producing a mixed blood offspring who spoke the native language of their mothers, and they spoke the English language of their fathers. And these mixed blood men who were bilingual could move freely between two populations. And geographically, these communities were in the South. And as they were taken west, they took many traditions with them as they became acclimated to European practices, ways of life, religion, farming methods, and enslavement of African people. It's very important to understand that it was this exposure, the late 1600s onward into the middle 1700s, that exposure, and I guess to one extent one might say the Europeanization of some of these native tribes that gave them a title that is stuck to this day, the 5 civilized tribes, which of course I always wonder, civilized as opposed to what? Uncivilized? Well, for many it meant more Europeanized. And of course the half or the mixed blood offspring often carried on the traditions of their fathers into the culture. There is an exception. The Seminole story is slightly different, and it must be pointed out, it is slightly different. You had individuals who were escaping bondage from the Carolinas and from Georgia, who were fleeing bondage and going into Florida. And there, they met a group of runaways from the Creek Nation who had political differences with members of the Upper Creek. These were Lower Creeks, and they had broken away. They were often called Red Stick Warriors because of the red batons that they took with them. But they met these Africans coming in from the Carolinas and Georgia, and they formed an alliance and decided to fight together. And by the time of Seminole removal in the late 1830s and 40s, there were Africans, both free and enslaved, who did get removed together with Seminoles. And to this day, the Seminole Nation does include, to this date, 2 bands. There are 14 bands in the tribe, 2 of which are African bands. One is the Bruner Band, Caesar Bruner Band, and the other is the Barkus Band, named after a Seminole freedman known as Doser Barkus. Those 2 bands are still to this day officially part of the Seminole Nation. But for the genealogist, after I had found a lot of this information, I became more interested in telling this story. Just as we all have unique stories to tell from our ancestral neighborhood, no matter where it was, there's something unique. Whether your folks are from Virginia, close to what we now know as the District of Columbia, or they're from Southern Virginia, near the North Carolina border, their story is different. Their story is different from the communities in what we would call Tidewater communities. They have a unique story. And regardless of where your family is from, hopefully you're committed to telling what is unique about your story or your ancestral neighborhood, because this is the place from which you're going to get the stories to tell. And I realized no one's ever talked about the stories from Indian Territory among the freedmen. That was my commitment that I made. Now, as I found that there was this large collection of records at the National Archives, I realized that there were types of records in this collection known as Dawes rolls. The name Dawes came from a man who worked in the government, federal government at the time, and this was the time when it was very clear that Indian lands were going to be made available for settlement of white settlers in the territory. But also it was decided, okay, land is held in common by the tribes. We're going to introduce single land ownership, divide it up into people who already own the land, but now in individual parcels of land. And they went through a process that took many years, beginning in 1898, ending in 1906. Remember, Oklahoma became a state in 1907. And eventually, they kept adding a few names of babies who had been born since that time, and they closed them finally in 1914. But the records that were made for those of us who are genealogists, there are the enrollment cards that you see. But there was a set of files known as application jackets. These are the files from which interviews come. And I found that Sam and Sally also had an interview. And then there were the final rolls where their name was finally collected one last time. And then that meant if their name was on that roll, they were now eligible to receive allotments of land before Oklahoma would join the Union. The enrollment cards for freedmen, folks from my part of Oklahoma, are Cherokee freedmen, freedmen miners, Choctaw freedmen, Choctaw miner freedmen, Chickasaw freedmen miners, Creeks miners, miners by blood, Seminoles, newborn freedmen.
All of them are reflecting whether a person was adult or child on this incredible set of records. The application jackets where those interviews are contained. You have Cherokees by blood, freedmen. And keep in mind, there were many freedmen who did have the blood of their Indian fathers. But the presence of their African mothers put them on a roll called freedmen, regardless of whether or not their father had been a person of African ancestry or Native ancestry. Most importantly for genealogists, these records exist, and they contain amazing, amazing stories. In the case of Sam and Sally, I was astounded, and I'll share with you some of that interview that I found in that file known as an application jacket. This interview took place in 1899, as you can see. And he was sworn in. He meets Sam, my great-grandfather. What is your name? Sam Walton. How old are you? About 56. Were you born a slave? Yes, sir. Who was your master? Josiah Harris. Where were you born? In Arkansas. Where were you at the time of the surrender? In the Choctaw Nation. Have you lived here ever since then? Right in the Choctaw Nation ever since. I have been out of the nation on business, but my home has always been in the territory. Did your master bring you from Arkansas over here? He sold me over here. This is a story you don't see in regular census records. And here is the voice of a man who died in 1912, telling the story that I'm reading now in 1991 at the archives. He sold me over here. Who to? Jim Davis. What was Jim Davis? Choctaw. Then a man was brought in, W.A. Welch. Do you know this man, Sam Walton? Yes, sir. Do you know whose slave he was before the surrender? I'm not very definite, but my memory is that he belonged to Jim Davis. Do you know where he has lived since the surrender? No, sir. The questions and answers went on. And the enrollment of Sally, his wife, my great-grandmother, came. And there was a man called Nell Perry who was brought in to testify. What is your name? Nell Perry. How old are you? About 64 years old. Keeping in mind this interview occurred in 1899. Do you know who she was freed under? The mother of Sally Walton was freed under my sister, Emily Perry. Was your sister Choctaw? Yes, sir. She was freed right here in the Choctaw Nation, was she? Yes, sir. Do you know whether she has any children? I don't know what children she has, but she had about 3 the last time you were there. And then, of course, Sam was brought back.
And he mentions, I have a stepdaughter, my wife's daughter. I went to her enroll. What is her name? Louisa Ingram. And finally, you can see at the very end, she's the daughter of your wife, yes. And finally, the outcome enrolled Sam Walton, his wife, 2 children, and stepdaughter as Choctaw freedmen. Their enrollment on this meant that every single person whose name was enrolled, who was accepted, every person received an allotment of land, even the children. If babies are listed on the front of the card and their name is on the final roll, babies also received an allotment of land. So this is how many families who were once enslaved in the territory were eligible for land allotment as well. And this is how land came into the family. As I said, the years of this series of interviews occurred between 1898 and 1914, and names were later added, the newborns and minors that you saw. Some of the names were later challenged because many said, but my daughter, her father is Chickasaw. We speak Chickasaw at home. Why is she not getting placed on the blood roll? And the reason why that became an issue was because if you were the Choctaw Nation, you got 40 acres of land, each person, which might say, oh, that's pretty good if it's a fairly large family. But if you were on the blood roll, each person got 120 acres, a bigger difference. In the Chickasaw Nation, Freedmen got 40 acres of land per head. And if you were placed on the Chickasaw blood roll, you received 320 acres. So many people were saying that my child's father is Native. And there were many cases challenging their placement on the Freedmen roll. In the Cherokee Nation, there were records that were created before the Dawes Roll. John Wallace was an agent and secretary of the Interior, and he created a record named after himself, the Wallace Roll. And there were people, this was collected in 1890. Dawes did not start until 1898. So those who were researching records and families earlier might find the same family on the Wallace Roll. And by the way, this particular roll can be found on the National Archives website, this particular one as well. There were also affidavits, statements that people made about who they were and who they were freed under. And you see an image, if you ask for the affidavits to the Wallace Roll, you have a cart with all of these boxes that will be given to you at the archives to go through, and each one is an affidavit of individuals whose names appear on the roll itself, where statements were also made. Before the Dawes Rolls, also in the Cherokee Nation, there was the 1880 authenticated Cherokee census. This was a census that was conducted in the Cherokee Nation of everyone, whether they were free people, whether they were people identified as Cherokees by blood. And as you look at that census, that 1880 authenticated Cherokee census, you'll see the name of the family. And you see whether they were native or adopted. You see that letter A in that column that follows the names, which means that they were adopted colored. The column, number 3, meaning their race and nationality, they were adopted colored Cherokees as well. And it was particularly of interest because you had people who were coming in from the deep south, who were coming in. They were leaving Mississippi, they were leaving Georgia, they were leaving other parts of the south, trying to get to Indian territory, and who were later considered intruders because they were not born there. But they were considered citizens of the tribe after freedom had come. There were also records of those who researched Creek Freedmen. Before the Dawes Rolls, there was a series of records known as Old Series cards. And typically, this is a record that one might find before the Dawes Rolls reflecting Creek Freedmen. And Creeks were very active in tribal government. One of the pictures that's often shown is the image of the gentleman who you see on the right. He traveled to Washington with the Creeks. He was an interpreter for the Creeks, fluent in both Muskogee Creek language as well as English. And he was frequently involved in tribal affairs. His name is Silas Jefferson, sometimes referred to as Silas Tucker, or often just Tucker. But he was very influential man. Also, among Creek Freedmen, as early as the late 1860s, 1867, there was the Dunn Roll. It's alphabetically arranged. It was originally copied by hand, but it had been retyped by the end of the century, and the names that went onto the Dunn Roll. And often when you look at a Creek card, they will tell you that this person's name appears on line number 934 of the Dunn Roll. This is the Dunn Roll that you will see. Among Choctaws and Chickasaws, there is the 1885 Choctaw-Chickasaw Freedmen Census, and all kinds of information is collected there. And before I go ahead, there was one column over on the right. I can't see it very clearly, but a question was asked, to whom they belonged before emancipation. So that information is very, very rich. That's there. But there are other sources of information that do reflect the same population. University of Oklahoma has a series 116 volumes of interviews that were collected in the 1930s. The same time the WPA was collecting information for the Slave Narratives Project, the state of Oklahoma, which became a state only in 1907, decided we need to interview anybody who lived here before statehood. So they interviewed individuals who were considered pioneers or part of Indian communities. And they interviewed individuals in those 116 volumes who were Black, white, or Native. And those interviews are extremely rich in detail. And this is another resource apart from the Dawes rolls or the Dawes records that one typically uses for researching the tribes in Oklahoma. And as I try to advance this screen, okay, I'm going to need some audio-visual assistance here to advance. One of the things that I also find that it is important, I will need some audio-visual assistance, is that when you're looking at records of individuals who are from the territory, understand we're looking at people who are not citizens of the United States. And it's something that these are records that began before 1907, and statehood which began, that's when you're going to find these populations in what we know as the federal census. These records, now of course you're looking at the screen reflecting the pioneer papers, but even prior to that time, there are all these other census records that if you're researching your family from Virginia, you've got census records that are going to go back to really the beginning of time, certainly the beginning of Virginia's time. But it is something that is very, very significant in terms of looking at records that are still telling you a story in terms of what was unfolding. Keep in mind, we're talking Western frontier. We're talking westward expansion. Have you ever heard of the Oklahoma land rush? 1889, when lands were being opened up for white settlers to come in. Statehood was fast approaching. And it is very, very important to understand. What you remember, if any of you watch, I'm not sure what television station or what cable station it is, where those Wagon Train and Gunsmoke and all those other shows appear, where you see those reruns, Bonanza. I didn't watch Bonanza. I had a crush on Little Joe. I know it's But the fact is that those are reflecting westward expansion. Sally, who I knew, lived through westward expansion. She saw those wagon trains, but in addition to that, I mentioned Judge Parker. She saw the outlaws. She saw Cherokee Bill. She saw the Rufus Buck gang. She also saw Buffalo soldiers who ended up being stationed in Forest City, right down the road from her part of what became Oklahoma. So these are some of the stories that are unique, but then every state has those stories that are unique to tell. And as I made a commitment, as I began to see these other sources of records, whether they were pioneer papers or whether they were Dawes records, and just to give you an overview and an idea of the quantity of records that we're talking about over 20,000 individual people. 20,000 people are going to generate hundreds of thousands of pages to look at, most of which have been microfilmed, and a good portion have been digitized, thankfully. Because when I first started, I literally had to drive to Washington to get online and, pull out the microfilm and to crank the microfilm through the machine to find these other sources of records. I think we're trying to get our audio-visual things here, and we might be able to advance so you can see some more things that I have to share. Okay. All right, thank you. And this particular image is the previous one you just saw, the overview that you see on that Oklahoma, University of Oklahoma Pioneer interview. This is the kind of interview that you see. Here's a man, his name is Benjamin Bruner, and he was being interviewed. That you're seeing. And he was saying, I was born in 1852 on the banks of the South Canadian River, near Fort Holmes and the old government bridge. His father was John Bruner, who was a Creek freedman. And he goes on and tells the fact that his mother, John Bruner's from Alabama, but his mother was a full-blood Seminole woman who came from Florida with the Seminoles. And he's talking about his family history. My father was a slave, and John belonged to Jim Factor. And he was sold for Confederate money for $3,000. And he's going on and telling more about his story. And he said, but father and one brother and their families, they went south during the Civil War, while three other brothers, Harry, Caesar, and Bill, went north with the Seminoles and served the Union Army to the coast of the river. Those men were some of the black members of the Indian Home Guards. And their story is not found among U.S. colored troops. Their story is found with Indian Home Guards. The only three Union regiments in the Civil War, because the rest of the Indian regiments in the Civil War from Indian territory were all Confederate, and we're talking over 20 Confederate regiments that were Native American coming from Indian territory. Keeping in mind, these were people from the South who brought their slaves with them, who wanted to keep their standard of life that had been supported by enslaved people supported them. And so he goes on, he mentions Harry and Caesar and Bill. What surprised me when I read that interview, because I realized, oh my God, Harry Bruner? That's Carol. He was a Creek freedman leader. And then here's Caesar Bruner, who was a Seminole freedman leader. And the Bruner Band today is named after this man's uncle, Caesar Bruner, which is absolutely amazing to me. There are military records from the United States colored troops and from the Indian Home Guards. And looking at the 79th and the 83rd, they began as the Kansas colored. They were organized in Kansas when one Creek chief fled into Kansas because he didn't want to be involved with the Board Army. He took his slaves with him. But when they got there, they realized able-bodied men had to enlist. He allowed his slaves to enlist, and he became head of the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Indian Home Guards. And there were many who enlisted with him. But there were others who came. And they became the 1st and 2nd Kansas Colored that were later redesignated as U.S. Colored Troops. As you can see Amos Adair on the right, he was born in the Cherokee Nation. You can also see Quashna Gilgreen, who was born in the Creek Nation. Again, the same story, same records that you may use when you get pension files. These individuals had pension files as well. Amazingly rich stories. So we fast forward now, 2017, 2 years ago. I'm very active in the genealogy community, and I follow a lot of other genealogists. We share a lot on Facebook. We have blogs. We write a lot. And I decided, I was paying attention to one of the bloggers. Some of you, if you're online, you may follow some of the bloggers. One was a woman called Amy Johnson Crow. And she has this project that she said, oh, I'm going to commit to, and I think she had done it the year before. I'm going to document 52 ancestors in 52 weeks. We should all do that. That'd be a fun thing to put on our blogs. And I'm thinking, oh, that's so cool. I don't have 52 people I want to write that much about. And I can tell you stories of Sally and a little bit about Sam, and I can tell you about my great-grandmother, a different Amanda, not her mother Amanda, but another Amanda on my mother's side. And I can tell you about Uncle Cephas, and I'd love to tell you about my favorite Uncle Cephas, but that's a different story. But I don't have 52 people that I really want to write biographies on, that I can write bios on. But then I thought about it. Wait a minute. I research all these freedmen from Indian Territory. Why don't I blog about 52 families in 52 weeks? Now, it sounds nice, when you're saying it and when you're not writing it. A whole lot of things sound nice when you come up with the idea. Well, I had made the commitment in January of that year to start to document 52 families. What was on my mind? Oh my goodness, that was a painful process because heaven forbid I would get busy and I just didn't get around to blogging that week. That meant the next week I had to do 2 families. And these are families from Indian Territory, all of which had enrollment cards, interviews. Some had interviews from the pioneer papers. They had land records, and I had to compile all of these family profiles. So if I missed a week, that the following week I had to do 2 that week. So I would spend many hours awake late at night to try and catch up. But fortunately, I was able to complete that task. And let's see here, if I can get this to advance again. And we have an AV issue again. If we have our person to come and assist with that, we seem to be a little bit frozen here. But I spent most of 2018. I was able to complete the process in 2017. I did actually end up documenting 52 families in 52 weeks. I was able to do that, but I decided, okay, now that I've done this, am I actually going to be able to put it in a story? I blogged 52 times, 52 stories, and if you go to my blog, AfricanNativeAmerican.blogspot.com, you'll see these original articles. But I realized everybody in the genealogy community doesn't get a line to read blogs. I know that. And I don't have folks in the genealogy community who are waiting patiently for my next blog update. So I realized, I wonder if I can put this in a book form. So I spent a good portion of 2018 deciding to put it in a book form. Now, it's one thing. I could have just copied and pasted every single blog issue and just put it all together. But that wasn't going to be a very reliable, a very interesting thing to read. So I had to get someone to assist me with that process. And I was very fortunate. Someone mentioned someone's name to me who was an editor, a lady sitting in your presence, who became my editor. Thank you very much. Yes, thanks to Jean Cooper, I was able to make sense out of those 52 family profiles. And at the end of many weeks of blood, sweat, and tears, and hopefully she will be willing to assist me with volume 2, because volume 1 was published this April. And thanks to the patience and the skill of my editor, without whom the book that you see on the screen would not exist. So I am very grateful for certainly her assistance. We were able to take, and I decided 52 families. First of all, if I put all the narratives together that I had written in those profiles, it was over 500 pages. I was not about to put that. That was just, it was too much certainly for me, certainly for her, certainly I wouldn't put that on the reader as a person. If they would be so kind to buy it, they probably wouldn't get around to reading it. I wouldn't get around to reading it ever again. But I was decided maybe I'll split the project. Put 3 of the different groups together, Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and volume 2 to come out at a later date would consist of the Freedmen Seminole families. And then, of course, after a lot of work with my dear editor, Freedmen of the Frontier, volume 1 was released this year. It is available on Amazon as well. But this is the story of how this book came. The compilation, you're looking at an image from just looking inside. If you go on Amazon and you know how you can look on the inside of a book, you can see the book is divided into parts. Part 1 being Cherokee Freedmen families, then Choctaw Freedmen families, and then Chickasaw Freedmen families. Keeping in mind that every single family has images from the enrollment card, their Dawes interview. In some cases, they're land-allotted record, and in some cases, the interviews from the pioneer papers as well, if there was one. It totals over, as I said, initially over 500 pages, but again, we decided to split it into two parts to make it more readable. Single family, and again, of all of them. With the Creeks and Seminoles, of course, there are even more pictures, some of the images that have been shared. These are the two individuals who are brothers. One is Creek and one is Seminole. The man on the left is Caesar Bruner, the leader of the Bruner band of Seminole Freedmen. The other one, Para Bruner, or Perry Bruner, as he's sometimes called, is his brother. Alex had taken a later point in life. He was a leader and an interpreter among Muskogee Creek Freedmen. And this is a picture of a wonderful woman whose story is going to appear in the second volume. This woman, Hagar Myers, who is the woman to whom it is said she was once enslaved in the Creek Nation, who single-handedly brought an end to the Green Peach War. If you do a Google search on the Green Peach War, you'll find that there was a group of people who were rebelling against the whole Dawes enrollment process. They're saying, why are they chopping up our lands? We want to go back to our own traditions. And they broke away and they rebelled. And there was a confrontation that occurred among as it was called, the snake factor among Creek citizens. And it was this woman who brought about an end to the violence that had occurred between the two factions in the Creek Nation. Her story will be in volume 2. But what I wanted to do with creating the book itself was to tell the story of individuals who had survived the Trail of Tears. They endured enslavement on the western frontier. They fought for their freedom. They were U.S. colored troops. They were Indian home guards as well. They watched people coming into their lands from the west. They lived through the Oklahoma land rush of 1889, and they made it to statehood. They finally became citizens of the United States in 1907. Their stories are undertold or untold, but by not telling the story, it's leaving a tremendous hole in the whole story of the western frontier. It's leaving a big hole in the story of the land that became the state of Oklahoma. Finally, I just want to just end you with just a few words of people who were interviewed in the 1930s, who sum up what their experience was like before statehood. There was a woman, Mary Grayson, who was a Creek freed woman, and she explains her situation. She was saying, you know, I'm what color people around here call Native. That means I didn't come here from somewhere in the old South after the war like so many Negroes did, but I was born right here in the old Creek Nation. My master was Creek Indian. That was 83 years ago, so I'm told. This woman was interviewed in the 1930s as part of the Pioneer Project. Henry Baptiste was a Choctaw freedman. There was a bunch of us Negroes who lived out about 12 miles from Andrews, near what was called Beaver Creek. What Negroes that lived there are mostly Choctaw freedmen who allotted land in that part of the country. There used to be a good many Negroes there, but they've all died out, and just a few left to tell the tale. Sarah Wilson says, yes, I was a Cherokee slave, and I am a Cherokee freed woman. And besides that, I am a quarter Cherokee by myself. And this is the way it is. This is the way it is. And as my great-grandmother Sally would say to you, Yakoke, which simply means thank you for your time. Thank you very much, everybody. Also for any audio-visual problems that we had. Are there any questions that anyone has about any of the records or anything that you may have seen? And I see a question way in the back. Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted a question.
Okay, the question was, were those freedmen, freed women, freed people, were they freed the same time as people were freed in the United States? The answer is no, they were not. Even though the Emancipation Proclamation, we know, was written in 62 and declared official in 1863, but it affected only those states that had seceded. And after the war, of course, the Civil War, the 13th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution was passed that officially abolished slavery. It was pointed out, we're not the United States. We don't have to free our slaves. Finally, it was determined in 1866, each tribe would come to Fort Smith with their tribe leaders to abolish slavery. There were many other things in the Treaty of 1866. You must not only free these people from bondage, you must also treat them as citizens of your nation, because these are sovereign nations, were sovereign nations. And some tribes did immediately, some reluctantly. The Choctaw Nation, freed people were not made slaves until 1885. That would have reflected my family from the Choctaw Nation. And the Chickasaws refused totally. They never adopted the freedmen. So citizenship did not come to Chickasaw freedmen until 1907, when they became American citizens when Oklahoma joined the Union. So, no, they were not freed after the Civil War, as did happen in the United States. Yes, another question. Well, Jean.
Did you make any information about the current state of citizenship in these tribes?
Do I have information? The question was about the current state of citizenship in these tribes. I follow it every single day. And the Cherokee Nation, after numerous lawsuits that began in the late 1980s, were given citizenship finally in 2017 after numerous lawsuits, and the more recent lawsuit having been filed in the U.S. Court of Appeals in May 2014. I was there when that case was heard in Washington. The judge finally made a decision that they were to be citizens. The tribe accepted that, and Cherokee freedmen are enrolled today. The Choctaw Nation does not admit former slaves. Most of the tribes in the 1970s quietly broke the freedmen out of citizenship. Many did not find until later, oh, there's an election coming up, I'm about to go and participate in the election. Some people showed up, had tribal cards snatched out of their hand. You're not citizens, we don't take you anymore, go away. And, but Creeks have a current case that is evolving right now. The Skokie Creek Freedmen Band that now has a current lawsuit, a pending lawsuit. Choctaw freedmen are not allowed to enroll. Seminoles are still part of the nation. They had a problem in the early 1990s. They were removed. They sued the nation. The U.S. government responded, said, if you're kicking these people out solely on race, we're going to terminate all funds to you. So they quickly put them back in. But of course, they're putting them back in as second-class citizens because they're not entitled to many of the benefits that other members get. So that's a separate issue. Chickasaws never adopted it. So Chickasaw freedmen will have to go a different way, a route legally, to challenge citizenship issues today. Is the lady behind you in blue? Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for the presentation.
Thank you.
And my question is about the form.
About?
The form that slavery took
Yes.
among the Indian nations.
So what was slavery like?
Yes, and I'm from southeastern Virginia near North Carolina.
Okay.
And these were field hands, workers,
Okay.
house slaves.
Right.
What
was enslavement like for
Yeah,
the enslaved?
and
the question was about the form of slavery, or what was slavery like for those who were enslaved in these 5 types in particular. First of all, understand enslavement of a human being is a violation of the human spirit. Whether you treat them nicely or not so nicely, when you own that person's body, family, subsequent generations, whether they are under the slavery, the grip of slavery, frequently or not, their movement is restricted as are following generations. Now, there are statements that are made that, well, they weren't treated exactly the same way. But at the same time, keep in mind, after Cherokee removal to the west, The largest slave rebellion west of Mississippi took place in 1842, when a group of people who were enslaved by Joseph Vann, who was the son of a wealthy chief, Chief James Vann, of Eastern Tennessee, Western Georgia. If you do a Google search, Chief Vann House, you can see the beautiful antebellum mansion that he lived in before moving to the West. But slaves in the territory rebelled in 1842. If you look at newspapers that were created in Indian Territory in the 1840s and 50s, you will see runaway slave ads all the time. And one of the ads, particularly by Walker Folsom from the Cherokee Nation, it appears in the Cherokee Intelligencer, 1851, where a man called Alec, who ran away, he placed it in a newspaper and said, oh yes, this guy's wearing this, that, he described him. If you can't read, take it alive, then I'll pay $50 for his scalp. The question is that how was enslavement for those who were enslaved? Probably not a good experience. Now, there are some who, if you read the slave narrative from Lucinda Vann, she talks about her life as a band slave. Oh yes, and we were band slaves, and we dressed very well. But you'll find stories like that in slave narratives from the Old South too. I think the most importantly, you want to read how things were described, and also read the words of those who were enslaved. There's one volume from the WPA slave narratives from Oklahoma and Texas, Oklahoma's combined, but you learn more about enslavement in Indian Territory from the Indian Pioneer Papers, and I really encourage you to take a look at that. Now, what kind of work did they do? They talk about that. Some worked in the field. They didn't grow cotton. That was not the major crop. They grew a lot of corn. Some of them worked on steamboats. Some of them, especially the women, had to do a lot of spinning. They did on spinning their own cloth, and a whole lot of domestic skills. If you read the interview with Lucinda Davis, she talked about her childhood as a slave in a Creek household. All she had to do was tend to a baby when her master's daughter had a baby, and her job was to just tend to the baby, as she describes what she was doing at the time when she saw the Battle of Honey Springs erupt in her neighborhood. She was a child, but she was a child with no child. She had to watch other children when she herself was a child. So the reader has to make that decision. It was enslavement. There were some who were probably more cruel than others. There were some who were perhaps treated them more humanely, but you find that situation in many places where people were quote-unquote enslaved too. So it's a complicated story with a complicated answer. So, yes, sir, you have a question.
Has there ever been any Native American in the representative cabinet?
I'm sorry, say it again.
Has there ever been any Native American in the representative cabinet?
Good question. I don't know the answer to that unless they came from Indian Territory. There could have been. My focus again being the territory, I don't know in terms of the status of the cabinet of the presidents who has maybe had some Indian presence in their ancestry, possibly. Of course, we know most of the early presidents were slave owners as well. So, but that's a good question and a good one to research. Maybe someone else knows the answer to that. I don't know the answer. Yes, sir, in the back.
Thank you. Enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you.
Kind of curious about the institutions that house some of these raw data.
The institutions that, say that again,
That house the raw data.
Yes.
Raw information.
yes.
Basic information. You mentioned the National Archives. You also mentioned military records. You also mentioned University of Oklahoma. Any other institutions in Washington, D.C. that would be housing some of these?
Archives 1 and 2. You will find, for example, in the late 1890s, a lot of Chickasaw freedmen were terrified they were going to be expelled from the nation, the only land that they knew as home. And you find that the Chickasaw freedmen and Cherokee freedmen formed an association. They had meetings, and the proceeds from the meetings of the freedmen organizations, those proceeds you will find at Archives 2 in College Park, Maryland. Majority of the freedmen records that you're seeing on the screen, those original records a lot of the challenges that were made to the status of enrollment, whether they're put on the Freedmen roll or whether they're put on the blood roll. Those challenges were made in numerous interviews. Those records are also in Fort Worth, Texas, as well, in numerous files. There's the Joe and David Perry file, Dora and Jesse McGee files. Those are all in Fort Worth and they're in microfilm. So we're going to go there to see some of those original records. Hopefully some more will become digitized, but maybe with time. And hopefully more people are beginning to research them. There will be more. I see another question in the rubber hand here. Did you have a question? The Dawes rolls that you were looking at, they're on both Ancestry and the land allotment records are on Family Search. Also on fold3.com, the Dawes records, including the cards and the interviews, are all online. In addition to that, the records of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, which many people know as the Guion Miller Roll. I mention that because 90,000 people applied, and we're talking early 1900s, from almost every state. I've seen applications of the Eastern Cherokees from New York City, folks who had no ties to the Cherokee Nation, but they heard there was going to be a $133 payment. So people submitted applications from all over. From Virginia, people applied. The same with the Mississippi Choctaws. Article 14 of the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit said, okay, you don't have to go west, you can stay here, but you must become United States citizens. And during the time of the Dawes rolls, they decided, okay, the Mississippi Choctaws, we'll give out a little piece of land too. So people heard of it, and they started submitting applications. 7,000 files, all of which are on both Ancestry and Folk. So, yes, another question.
It's land that became Oklahoma before Oklahoma was finally opened up for settlement and to become a state.
But it really began, the distribution of that land began with the 1889 Oklahoma Nation. Yes, ma'am. Many did purchase their slaves. Slaves cost money. One of the most expensive commodities in what became the U.S. No one was giving away slaves. They were purchasing them, definitely. It was said in the Choctaw Nation, many people sold furniture, sold ponies or whatever, so they could purchase slaves before removal. And removal started with the Choctaw Nation in the winter of 1830 and 1831. Some had funds already because many were children they were biracial children of white men and Indian women. And many of these people sent their children to Ivy League schools. The leaders of the tribes are very sophisticated. And what the image we have from television, the westerns that we used to see, that did not reflect that these five nations in particular. They were
Many of them very well. They were very privileged, a privileged class. Well, thank you all very much, and I hope that you enjoyed hearing part of my story. And there are a few books that we do have in the back, if any of you are interested. And the book can also be purchased from Amazon. And I thank you, and I, of course, thank my editor as well. So thank you all very much.